Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Well, it's been a while, but it's time to check in with our monthly panel to discuss the latest. Back with us are Joe Oliver, former Canadian Finance and Natural Resources Minister, Sandra Pupatello, former Trade and Economic Development Minister in Ontario, and Gary Marr, former Alberta Cabinet Minister and Alberta Rep in Asia and Washington. He's now head of the Canada West Foundation. Welcome back, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
This is kind of the year in review and the year to look forward to session for us. So let's assess Canada's economy at year end. And obviously there are some positives and negatives. Maybe Joe Oliver, start us off with your review of 2022 economically.
Well, it's been a very tough year. As you know, the pandemic produced some very strong stimulus measures, some of which were clearly excessive in Canada, greater than any other country in relation to GDP. And now we find out that some of that money, tens of billions, was spent needlessly, and it's going to be difficult to recuperate. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. So that type of fiscal stimulus, while critical to some degree, was excessive, and it's exacerbated the global inflationary environment. And so the central banks were late to the scene in recognizing that inflation was going to be enduring rather than transitory. And the Bank of Canada was one of a number, and they've all admitted that they were wrong. So now we're in a period of rising interest rates with a hope that we're sort of getting ready to peak out, just maybe. But there's not too much hope, I don't think, just yet, that while inflation can be arrested and start coming down, that it would actually get down to the 2% target. So we've got some heavy still to do, and a lot of pain, because it looks like a global recession is almost inevitable.
Right.
High likelihood of a recession in the United States.
Well, we'll talk about 2023 in the next segment for sure. But I do want to hear perhaps from Gary a little bit of a better story economically in Alberta this year. Does that sort of color your view of the economy generally, or did you still see the downsides?
Well, we still see the downsides, of course. I mean, inflation being a big part of that, regardless of where you are in the country. The improvement in the price of oil and natural gas has been helpful, of course, and has put a lot of money into the coffers of provinces that are producing energy, whether it be Newfoundland and Labrador, Alberta, or Saskatchewan. So it has certainly helped the bottom lines of provincial governments that rely on natural resource revenue. That doesn't necessarily always translate into jobs. We've still got, about 30% of downtown office space here in the city of Calgary that's vacant because oil and gas companies have done tremendous work at reducing their overheads in producing a barrel of oil. So even though there is money coming in as a result of the sale of that commodity, it doesn't necessarily translate into large jobs. So there's still some challenges that have been experienced in 2022. I'd say overall it was a mixed bag of results.
Right. And Sandra, what's your perspective on 2022?
Well, I feel like the nation sort of deciding, okay, I guess we're hunkering down here. This isn't a blip. This is going to go on for some time. And it certainly started early in 2022 when we realized it's not just about the pandemic ending. Now we've got other supply chain issues thanks to a war going on in Ukraine started by Russia. And I think we're more cognizant now of this globalization of our supply chain more now than ever before. So when a great big, a 10 kilogram bag of wheat or flour used to be $8 and now it's 18 at the superstore. I think that's shocking, because it's like we're just throwing $10 on the price of all of these basic goods. And yet we understand, oh, well, I guess so much of the wheat is coming or used to come from Ukraine. So I think we are hunkering down. It was a very tough year in that way. Inflation, so price of foods, price of gas, everybody's sort of rethinking some of the discussion lately about what are you going to do on vacation? And we're really tamping down our spending. So that tells us that the population is responding, just like
Right.
the Bank of Canada thought we would.
Right, exactly. We're going to take a brief break. I'm sorry, we're out of time for the first segment, but we'll be back. Joe, you had a point that you wanted to make about trade and whatnot and the energy issues, so please make that point.
Yes, I think another big event that happened this year and is going to have repercussions next year and beyond is the energy crisis, which centered in Europe but wasn't confined to it. I mean, it has its origins with Angela Merkel's decision to get off nuclear in Germany, and I guess the magical thinking that renewables could replace fossil fuels, and that crisis was already building before Russia invaded Ukraine, and then of course that exacerbated it tremendously. So national security has been eroded, costs have ballooned, and countries are desperate to heat the homes of their citizens and not do so in a way which is going to prevent them from affording the food that they need to live. You know that energy prices, electricity prices in the UK are the highest in the world.
Right.
Germany is taking down windmills to access coal mines. And I just heard that this is amazing that Switzerland is talking about restrictions on the use of electric vehicles because of concern about not having enough power to supply them. So there's some lessons to be learned, and of course Canada needs a lot of lessons, because we might have had an opportunity with our immense oil and gas to have helped our European allies, but we literally can't deliver.
Well, I mean, is there a future opportunity? The rest of the panel, I noticed that the UK, by the way, is opening up its first new coal mine in decades. So this is a trend. Sandra, did you want to weigh in on this one first?
Well, I guess I've been pretty open about my views on taking opportunities to help the globe from Canada. And that really does mean that we've got to take a good way to get our energy out of the ground. And I think our companies have done better and better at that every year. They're doing that in more of a carbon footprint free way than before. But we do have to get those pipelines, access, send it. I mean, we had those announcements when the Germans arrived in Newfoundland to talk about hydrogen potential. So there is a lot going on. And I think the crisis made us sort of have a better look at ourselves to say, what can we do in the meantime while we're getting into renewables, while we're getting into other and better sources of energy? Getting people to natural gas instead of coal does a tremendous good for the economy. And I think we need to know that so we can produce that and we can ship that. And I think we've got to look at this incremental benefit that Canada can produce for the world and get on it. And frankly, I think the Ukrainians would prefer to have some kind of heat, even if it's from natural gas right now.
Yeah. Gary, sorry, Joe.
Well, I say that the Prime Minister should appoint Sandra Pupatello as the Minister of Natural Resources in Canada.
Now, Elizabeth, you heard it here first.
Because you had so much fun with that job, didn't you, Joe?
Gary, let's give Gary a shot at this, because I'd love to get Gary's reaction when the Germans announced their LNG multi-decade agreement with Qatar, and we're probably kind of on the sidelines in tears. So, Gary, how did you feel about that?
Well, I think it bespeaks of the prime minister, who you'll recall said that there was no business case that he'd seen for LNG in Canada. I think that the evidence is quite abundant with Qatar that in fact there is a strong case for it. I think it was inappropriate or wrong for the prime minister to say that in the first place, because it's not his job. It's a decision that companies should be making as to whether or not there's a business case. The issue for the prime minister is actually the process by which there can be approvals for large-scale projects of infrastructure or LNG terminals and so on. And this is, really noted in 2022 that we haven't had approvals of any such projects under the current, what used to be called Bill C-69, now called the Impact Assessment Act, which is going to the Supreme Court of Canada in March of 2023. Regardless of what the decision is.
I'm going to have to break you off there, though. We are taking a brief break. We'll catch up with you, Gary, right after the break. Please stay with us. Gary, you were in the midst of describing the energy situation, so please continue.
Oh, just that in March of 2023, the Supreme Court of Canada is going to hear a challenge that's being put forward by all 10 provinces of Canada, challenging the Impact Assessment Act. And I think this is going to be important because regardless of what the court decides, there will be a public policy vacuum as to either how do you fix the legislation should the court decide that it is constitutional, and if the court decides it's not constitutional in whole or in part, how do you fix that? So these are important issues for being able to resolve before we can get on to actually dealing with the infrastructure that we need, be it ports, be it LNG, be it rail, be it roads, be it pipelines. All of the above require this assessment act to be reasonable. And as we're going to talk a little bit later about electric vehicles, I mean, there's good news for the auto sector. But if we go down the road of EVs, we're going to need critical minerals in order to do that. And the Impact Assessment Act will also be an important part of making sure that we can actually get mine permits and get the mines and minerals out of the ground to be able to provide the kind of material that's needed for electrification of our motor vehicles in Canada.
Let's switch gears, pardon the pun. And Sandra, it's been quite a year for the auto sector, which of course is concentrated and based in the province of Ontario. Maybe take us through some of the things that you noticed about some of the announcements that have been made by the federal and provincial governments in this area.
Well, I think there's been quite a move in research and development around batteries, especially in Quebec and Ontario. But probably it hit the high note when Stellantis made their large announcement, their tie-up with LG in Windsor to build a large battery plant. That sort of solidified Ontario's position in the world. And frankly, the whole globe was watching and saying, what? That big investment is going to Windsor. Which, as people in Canada would know, it's the auto capital of Canada. But of course, we're always in competition with Michigan, with Tennessee, with these states in the South that are, throwing massive amounts of incentives towards these companies. And cities aren't allowed to do that in Canada. So it's really left to how aggressive will the provinces and the federal government be in incentivizing these companies to come. And I have to say, the Champagne, our federal minister, is doing a phenomenal job. He is like nonstop with these OEs around the world. There was just a discussion this week about VW and what may or may not happen. More exciting news, though, that there's sort of like a double-edged sword there. Once we start making announcements, the rest of the jurisdictions get even more aggressive, so it becomes harder to get the next one. So, we have to stay tuned that we're on a roll right now and people can see the benefit. Companies like VW are actually asking their suppliers questions like, are you producing your part for my car using green energy? Few jurisdictions and say what Ontario says, which is 90% of our energy is green between nuclear and hydro. So it leaves very little that isn't. And that's really good news for us when big companies like VW say, I'll only build a plant where I can access green energy. So that's sort of like the new world in sustainability that actually helps Canada land an investment against a state like Tennessee that just throws gobs of money at companies. So I think we're going to see lots of good news in 2023 with both Fidelli at the provincial level. I've got to take my hat off to this guy, the Conservative government, and of course, Champagne with the federal Liberals. I think they are working in tandem, and it's good for business in Ontario.
Joe Oliver, we've got about a minute before the next break, but can you start us off with your prognostications about 2023?
Well, I think we're going to have some initial bad news. I think there's going to be clearly a slowdown. It's likely to be a global recession. Probably mild, but what one hopes, and in the United States as well. So it's hard to see how Canada can really escape that. We can move out of that, and so I think one can be a lot more positive about the rest of the year. But there's going to be some considerable pain. And what concerns me is that the federal government really hasn't yet taken into account, the rhetoric notwithstanding, that they're going to have to be spending less because you can't borrow your way to prosperity.
Let's pick up on that point after the break, Joe. So any other thoughts about 2023 that you'd like to share?
Yes, I was talking about the debt burden and how interest rates are driving up the annual interest charge for the government, which I believe is forecasted to be about $53 billion annually, starting in 2025. That's more than the projected cost of our military. You cannot borrow your way to prosperity, even when interest rates are initially low. And of course, they don't stay low if you're expanding the money supply, and of course, in this case, exacerbated significantly by supply chain problems, which are abating, but still energy costs are high, and we're dealing with this as a phenomenon. So the point is, there's a global problem. That's an externality, but the question is, what do we do to alleviate the problem rather than exacerbate it?
Right.
My concern is fiscal policy is going the wrong way.
Gary Marr, what worries you about 2023?
Well, let me say this. 2022 was a VUCA environment. It was volatile, it was uncertain, it was complex, and it was ambiguous. I think VUCA continues into 2023. In 2022, we had, a Russian invasion of Ukraine. We had an energy crisis that precipitated that from that. We have, issues with respect to inflation, supply chain failures. 2023, we're not sure what's going to happen, but I think we can continue to expect that there will be volatility, there will be uncertainty, which will make it very challenging for policymakers to set the right course. This is the issue that we had with COVID. Politicians didn't know what to do because they're not scientists. Scientists didn't know what to do because it was so uncertain. Nobody really knew what COVID was about. So there were lots of decisions that were made that in retrospect turned out to be wrong. Some turned out to be right. But I think 2023, we're going to see more of this kind of uncertainty and volatility, not just in Canada, but around the world.
Sandra Pupatello, where do you land on 2023?
I want to be hopeful. I remember Tiff Macklem making earlier statements from the Bank of Canada that the ideal is that they're going to be headed back to a 2% inflation in a couple of years. So I was thinking, well, I think they better get started if they're going to get there in a couple of years with those interest rates, as one of the few tools that they have to make an impact. people in their 50s and 60s who were buying properties when the interest rates were at 2 and 3, they're just shocked that they're at 5 and 6 now. But the guys who are 70s and 80s, they remember their purchases when they were gobsmacked by interest rates at 18 and 20%. So they're kind of saying, yeah, well, you haven't seen anything yet. So it's almost like our perspective based on our own experience. I think interest rates are really high. And for young people, they're going to hold back on making serious purchases, which slows the economy. Because when you buy a new house, you buy furniture, you buy paint, you buy supplies, and that, if you slow all that down, that's going to have an impact on our economy. So if I had to have a wish list for next year, it's going to be that we start dragging those interest rates back down and getting people to spend their money on things that matter to their local neighborhood stores. We can feel, I know my own behavior is such that I start looking at, gee, how much am I spending on that? I think I'll do without that this time. And you don't want that to take root. And they say you make a habit in 3 months. So I want to see some hope in 3 months so that we don't change our habits for good.
We've got 30 seconds left. I think we're going to have another panel in January to talk about U.S. trade relations, China. There's all this other stuff that's going to have an impact on things. But Joe, do you have any sense of optimism at all for next year?
Oh, sure. Never sell the American economy short for very long. And I think there's a resilience that we're going to see, but it's going to be tough going for a while. But I think we'll be feeling a lot better, I'm hoping, a year from now when we review 2023.
We will indeed. Yes, sorry, Gary. We have
I just
2
wanted
seconds.
to say, the Canadian government issued an Indo-Pacific strategy during the middle of a World Cup game. It's a good strategy as an objective. There's a lot of we don't know yet that is actually contained within the document itself. So that's something that could be very helpful going forward.
Put it on our January list for the panel. Absolutely, Gary. I appreciate it, and I wish all of you a very blessed holiday season, and we'll see you again next year.